Episode number 120 of the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. Welcome to the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. I'm Michelle, a fertility acupuncturist here to provide you with resources on how to create a wholesome approach to your fertility journey. My guest today is Jenni Hulburt. Jenni is a fitness coach, essential oil specialist, host of the Wild Wellness podcast, and creator of the Workout Without Burnout Blueprint. She has a Bachelor of Science and Master's degree in exercise science and sport psychology, and is also a wellness advocate with doTERRA, teaching people about essential oils for non-toxic living, natural health, and creating a home apothecary with the power of plants. Everything she offers is to help women live and sweat in sync with nature. She believes you can reach your goals without sacrificing your well-being as you seek to embody what nature has always modeled. It's not a sprint, but a cycle. So welcome to the podcast, Jenni.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm honored to be here.
So give us a little information about yourself, your background.
Sure. Like you, am interested in health and wellness. I have been for a long time, but at one point it sort of looked a little bit more like an obsession, I would say, or just overdoing in a lot of ways. When it came to food, came to exercise, I actually was one of those people who, tended to go too hard too often. And I didn't really learn in my education, even what I needed to learn about understanding the different cycles and rhythms of our bodies, especially as women. So my background education is a bachelor's in exercise science and my master's degree is in sports psychology. But as I said, that really set me up for learning a lot about working with people in fitness and in health. And I worked as a personal trainer for a while, but in my own journey, I got to a point where I realized I was really tired all the time and not recovering well. And a lot of the principles that I had learned, I was applying them, but not necessarily in terms of what a woman's body needs in terms of a cycle. And that has been a really important shift for me to not only realize that for exercise, but also in terms of my hormone health and just overall well-being. So that's what I love to share and teach women really how to live and sweat in sync with their cycle and nature, because that's
awesome.
Our guide.
Yeah, totally. So what, I mean, you had mentioned being tired. What other symptoms were you having, or how did it affect you, or did it affect your cycle as well?
Yeah, for me, it did show up with a lot of fatigue. And, if I could grab a nap in the afternoon, I had to, because it was like the way to get me through the day. I wasn't able to do the workouts that I had been doing. I wasn't recovering well. I was getting a lot more headaches, and I did have a lot more pain around my period. So I knew something was off. My digestive system wasn't functioning as optimally, as not as well as it had been. And even mood wise, I was feeling these highs and lows, and more lows than I had been feeling. And I remember going to a practitioner who just wanted to put me on an antidepressant. And I just knew that wasn't the fix. It was just kind of putting a Band-Aid on one small issue that she noticed. But I finally found someone who looked at it from more of a functional medicine perspective and more holistically, and got help that way. So all kinds of physical and emotional signs that I noticed personally.
And so when you were doing that, you had mentioned seeing a functional medicine specialist. So was that the first person, or was there somebody who kind of brought it to your attention? Hey, maybe you're exercising too much.
Really, that wasn't even the first thing that came up. When I went and got my hormones tested and started looking into that, I'll back up for a sec, because even just in my own personal research, I kind of had a feeling that what I was experiencing, it looked and sounded like I had adrenal issues and some things going on with hormones. So I wasn't surprised when I went to get some tests. I had already started to work with the things that I could have control over, and started to pay attention more to my sleep and winding down at night and getting off technology and moderating what I was doing with exercise, because not only was I not motivated to do it, but I knew that if I was going too hard, that wasn't helping either. So I started to shift some things myself. And then I got tested with hormones and realized really what I needed to pay attention to specifically, and got some more help with knowing exactly what was going on. And it was a progressive journey with understanding how to start to work out differently, because it wasn't just as simple as, okay, we'll work out less, or take a break, or, take more rest days. I really started to dive more into learning about my cycle and wanting to address the issue of having pain, because even after recovering, I would say, with the adrenal issues and feeling a lot better with my energy and my sleep and everything else, I still had a lot of pain around my period. And so I was still trying to sort that out. And that's actually what led me more to discovering this cyclical nature that we have, and the shifts that maybe I needed to make with exercise. And so that was another layer then that helped even more. And it's impacted both of those things.
That's great. I love working with the cycle. I really believe in it. And because we are cyclical, it's something that just sets us apart really from our male counterparts. And so it really does make a difference. And for me personally, I used to work out during my period. I don't anymore. Well, because I like hot yoga. And I remember reading in one of the ancient, when I was studying Chinese medicine, and they said that we have these vital fluids, blood, sweat, and it's not good to lose both at the same time. So too much sweat while you're bleeding. And I remember feeling very drained during that time. So now I just don't even fight it anymore. I back off. And I'm okay. Like, I feel better. I feel better just allowing my body to rest and kind of going with that flow and just allowing that space and time. So it's kind of interesting. But you had mentioned, obviously, you went through this and it was something that you were inspired to do because of your own experience. How did you figure out how to cater exercise with the cycle?
Yeah, like you, I feel the same way. And that's really interesting what you said about traditional Chinese medicine, because I hadn't heard it.
Yeah, intuitively you knew.
Worded that way before, even though that's, a lot of the recommendations out there suggest that maybe if you work out during your period, that it'll help with symptoms, help with cramps, help with feeling better. And that was never my experience. So that's one of the myths that I think women should be aware of too, just as a side note, because I think a lot of times we get under this obligation and guilt, or what we should be doing in terms of anything health related, especially with exercise and fitness, and just trying to do what we should do, that model, or being consistent. And being consistent doesn't mean you do it every day, and I think it needs to look different in different times of our cycle. And maybe we also get concerned about not doing enough, or losing what we have gained if we take a day off or take a break. So when I started to understand the cycle, it was really one of the most pivotal books for me was called Wild Power. And it's a book about the menstrual cycle, and they relate it to the 4 seasons, which really resonated with me because of nature. So the menstrual phase being inner winter, and then follicular inner spring, ovulatory inner summer, and then the luteal phases inner autumn. And when I started to just notice the shifts of tracking my cycle and noticing those shifts energetically, how I felt, what I was having a craving for, what I wasn't craving during that time, foods that I was interested in, movement that I wanted or didn't want to do, that was one way that it really started to help me. And then it made me realize that following my workouts in the same rhythm was sort of a missing piece, that I wasn't paying as much attention to that. So that's when I started to really develop a plan for myself to follow and notice the patterns, notice that I didn't feel like doing much of anything on the first day, and day 1 and day 2, and then noticing when I felt the most energized and optimizing that, noticing also when I was maybe more inclined for cardio endurance type things versus strength training, and when I seem to recover easier and not recover so easily, and just those patterns. So one of the most important things that I did was not only being aware of the fact that I had a cycle and different phases to pay attention to, but tracking that alongside of my cycle days so that I could see, what kind of patterns were going on.
And what did you, so what were those cycles, or how does that look like?
Yeah. So what I reframe them as, I still think of them as the seasons, of course, but I also refer to them in my teachings as the base, build, peak, and recovery phases. So still those 4 phases, but the menstrual phase would be your base. That phase is going to be generally where you are just kind of coming back to maintenance. It's not necessarily the time of the cycle where you need to be focused on or having that goal of building or making gains. I mean, like you said, your body is releasing during that time. It already has something major to do. That's enough. And so just during that phase, it's about base, it's about doing what feels good. And, there is mixed literature out there with what is optimal during that phase, because sometimes we might see in some literature during the later part of that phase that's a time for women to optimize strength training because of the increase in estrogen, but that would be later in that phase, and we're dipping into the follicular phase or the build phase when hormones are on the rise. So I call it the build phase then, because your energy is rising at that point, and that's when you maybe start to shift into more activity, but not going too hard, too fast, because it's a progression. And it is, even though we're talking about a cycle, you are kind of thinking of it on a linear path at that point, because estrogen is rising sort of in that manner. And that's a hormone that's going to help us to feel more energized, more outward, more capable. We're actually more resilient to cortisol during that phase. So we could always talk about that. But when you're exercising intensely or very frequently, you're going to have a rise in cortisol, and you don't want that to be sustained all the time. You want to be able to come back to that rest state and not be in fight or flight always. But during that phase, you may be able to handle high intensity bursts a little bit more. So things like sprints or interval type classes, or classes like a spin class where maybe you will have ups and downs in there, and it is more intense for you. And then that next phase would be the peak phase. So I call that peak because your estrogen is going to be peaking during that phase. Testosterone would be higher too. And a lot of your hormones are coming to a peak, as well as your energy, because that's going to be around ovulation. And again, you have the most outward energy during this time, but maybe now that you've built up to that, you have the capacity for even longer endurance type things. So whether that's a longer yoga class or a long run, it doesn't have to just be what you typically think of as long endurance. You might be listening and thinking, well, I'm not an endurance runner or an endurance person, but it could just mean longer in whatever activity you do, whether that's walking, yoga, or a longer strength training, or more sets or repetitions even in an exercise. And then you start to come down on the recovery phase. And I call that the recovery phase because that really is the primary goal that I have found is most beneficial. The luteal phase is when progesterone is going to be rising and be at its highest. So when we have that, progesterone is going to really get us into that phase or feeling of not wanting to do a lot. We're going to feel less motivated. We're going to maybe not have as much energy. And when we have that, we often beat ourselves up with fitness because it's like, well, I don't feel like doing what I normally do. And we're trying to keep up with this standard, right? of being consistent and working out every day and doing what we should do in that way. So this is often the most difficult phase for women to wrap their heads around, because they're not going to feel like themselves in a lot of ways. And yet, if we understand the cycle and you understand that this is a phase for recovery, then you can set yourself up with things that are still focused and still really helpful for you, but it doesn't have to look like the rest of the cycle. Every phase has its purpose, and one of the things you might even focus on in this phase is things that you've been neglecting throughout, and maybe even more subtle exercises, more focused on a particular issue that you have, or just things that are slower and gearing you down. But when you do things slower, sometimes you do have more focus and more awareness, and that's really beneficial. Because if we just keep breezing right past, well, you heard my story and how that goes. So
yeah, and it sounds like you're working with yourself instead of against yourself. And we're not really meant to work against ourselves. I think when we do, we drain our emotional energy so much more.
Exactly. Yeah, both, but physical and emotional. You're right.
Yeah. And so it's working smarter, not harder.
Yeah, in everything. You know, the cycle phases contribute to the way that we approach the rest of our life too. And it certainly helps me approaching it that way and thinking of business activities and just everything else that I do, you know, and when you want to be around people versus maybe spend more time alone, and when's a good time to reflect, and when's a good time to produce or create. Yeah, all those things.
Yeah, because you'll be that much more powerful and effective if you're really riding that wave. It's something that I always come back to is Wu Wei, which is effortless effort. That's how nature works, and nature is very cyclical, and it has a time and place for everything. And so it's really just kind of honoring that, because our body is nature, or part of nature. Our mind is part of nature. Our spirit's part of nature. Everything's within us has an intelligence to guide us. It's about listening to that.
Yes, and I feel inspired to add here about the fact that if a woman doesn't have a menstrual cycle for whatever reason, that one other anchor that we have is the moon phases.
That's right.
And new moon being day one of menstruation, and then full moon would be ovulation, and all the way back to new moon again. So you can still follow those days, but the outer seasons are also a real anchor for us, I think, because if you notice you don't have the same motivation or the same desire for certain workouts, movements, whatever you like to do, there's a reason for that, right?
There is a reason for that. And it's really honoring kind of what our body is telling us, because our body is telling us that for a reason, and realizing that it's this intelligence that has a space and that should be honored. And it's interesting you say that, because with seed cycling, we do the same thing. Or, you know, just really, if there's no phase, then we work on the moon.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And
it's amazing.
When you said, did you say seed cycling?
Cycling, or even just in general, or I have certain herbs that I shift, you know, for per cycle, but it's the same kind of thing. That's the one anchor that we can really rely on if we don't have anything else. And I love it because we are part of nature.
Yeah, we can't separate from that, even though we sometimes become a little bit more distant from it, depending on our lifestyle. But that's the goal, to get back and get closer to it.
Yeah, for sure. And you had mentioned before about myths. What are fitness myths that women should be aware of?
Yeah, we talked about one of them a little bit already, actually, with the idea that working out consistently doesn't necessarily mean that we need to do it every day or do the same thing every day. Sometimes I think, you know, you get on to something that you like, and maybe you like a certain class, so you think going 3 days a week is a good plan. But a lot of times when we think of it in that way, then we don't consider those other phases of the cycle that we might not feel like doing that particular activity, or that might not be the best thing for our body. And it's like this idea that we have that if we don't show up, or if we don't do what we said we were going to do, then we start to really beat ourselves up for that. And so it's just the concept of really embracing a little bit of a wider perspective with that, I think, and not necessarily believing that you have to do that consistent same thing. You know, you can have a little bit more variety in there. And when you know how you feel throughout your cycle, then you can sort of have a menu and pick from different things that are going to be best suited depending on what phase you're in. And that can be really helpful.
Yeah, without a doubt.
And I think a lot of training recommendations are important to consider too, not necessarily a myth, but in a way it can be, because we think that when we see training recommendations, or when we see even like a workout plan, it starts at one point and it helps you progress so that you're doing a little bit more. But a lot of times they're based on a very linear model that would be suited for more masculine, more like a man's energy and their cycle, because it's not a monthly cyclical like we have. So that's something to pay attention to if you're handed a plan or you are working with one, to kind of ask yourself, is there any cyclical nature to this? Because you can always adjust it that way. And that's part of what I teach, is how to really take anything and make it cyclical. But a lot of times it's not just handed to us that way. So we have to be careful with that. And also the idea that it's normal to be sore or worn out from a workout. Because of course that is a sign oftentimes that we are adapting. We have to stress the body to a certain extent, so then it will adapt and get stronger, or will develop better endurance. So to a certain extent that can be true sometimes. But if you're noticing that you are consistently not recovering and consistently sore, and you have some of those other symptoms of maybe a higher resting heart rate, or you're not sleeping well, or your hormones are off, a lot of those other things, then just pay attention to really how often you're beating your body down and maybe not allowing for that recovery, because it's that whole go hard or go home, philosophy mentality that
it's true.
There's a fine line there with doing a certain amount that's going to support us, to be able to challenge ourselves, which a lot of us love to do. And it can be a great thing, but without feeling depleted at the end too often.
Yeah. And it becomes almost like a dogma, because I've had many patients come in and they were like really addicted to exercise. And I used to say that being addicted to exercise is better than being addicted to sugar or anything like that, things like that. But I kind of, say that in balance, because too much exercise can stop a cycle completely. It's obviously, as we were talking, it can actually really deplete the body. And so talk about the addiction, because that's a really tough one. I mean, I had one person actually, she just recently got pregnant. She came in, one of my patients, and she came in the first time and I told her, listen, you're exercising too much. Just tone it down a little bit. Well, I like to work with people, obviously, and not tell them you can't do this or that. But I think she got a little resistant, and then she didn't come to me for months. And then finally, at her own time, realized, and I planted a seed, and she implemented changes and changed her workout routine and did tone it down, and then came back, and then we worked together for a couple of months, and then she got pregnant. But it really does affect the body. It affects the cycle. It affects even the lining. I mean, we talk about like how it can impact your energy. And another thing too is I've even seen a correlation with hypothyroid.
Yeah, that was actually what I was on the way to with my testing. It was my thyroid was down regulating, or it was down regulating, I think, related to my adrenals producing over cortisol all the time and not getting that reprieve. So I actually think of, with what you just said, how oftentimes we enjoy moving our bodies to relieve stress, to move energy, and it's so helpful that way. But sometimes I think we can use it as what would be like almost an avoidance of not maybe addressing those things with other tools, because there's a lot of ways that you could relieve stress or move energy. And I'm not saying that exercise isn't a great way to do that either, moving your body in some way, but there's a lot of different ways that can look, so that you're not getting into that cycle where, yes, your cortisol levels naturally rise when you move your body. And they actually, as you know, and your patients, probably a lot of them, they naturally rise and fall throughout the day, spiking in the morning when you first wake up and being higher then, and then going down later in the day. But when we do intense exercise and our body releases cortisol, and maybe it's too frequent or too long of duration, the body gets into a pattern where that cortisol really doesn't come down enough, and we don't get into that rest and digest parasympathetic state
Mm-hmm.
enough. And so then that's when we would notice a lot of those things. So it's all in relationship to other stressors in our life too, I think.
Yeah.
Because if you aren't considering the other ways that you might be having cortisol, or when you might be having cortisol throughout the day. So just think of other stressors, other moments that you might actually be getting those cortisol spikes, whether it's intense conversations or emotions around anything. It could be work related, it could be relational, it could be emotional, it could be even food or digestive related, causing inflammation in the body. There's so many other stressors that we have. And that's one of the things that I encourage people to actually keep track of or chart in tracking their cycle alongside their workouts is what would you say your stress level is on a day to day? Because if you're matching that high stress with high intensity exercise, then it may support you for a little while. But in my experience, after time or over time, if you're not moderating that exercise and you're only using it to help move energy and release stress, then after a while, it doesn't always do what you hoped it would do to release stress. It's actually keeping you in that fight or flight state too often. And you start to have all of these things that we talked about that really make you feel burned out.
Absolutely. And I wanted to also talk about how obviously with food, everybody's so different. So do you cater workouts depending on the individual and what they're able to handle, or their patterns of life, or how they feel?
Yeah, and what I really love to teach is how people can notice their own patterns and then adjust that. A lot of times it's starting with that tracking of their cycle and their workouts, and then using intuition to guide them oftentimes, and following what they see in that cycle to then start to adjust. So for example, if you do notice that your energy is always low at a certain time of the month, then start to plan for and expect that you're going to do lower intensity workouts during that time, whatever that would look like. So if you're on a running plan, maybe that's not the week that you do 3 workouts, it's maybe 1 or 2, or if you're training for something in that way. So just knowing what your patterns are and seeing what you can do there. And also knowing that each cycle could be different, because a lot of times you might notice that you're supposed to feel more energized during that ovulatory peak phase that I call it, but maybe you have some days where you're just not feeling that great. So it's noticing what other factors might be influencing that you're not overdoing it even in that phase. Because a lot of times we get that green light of like, oh great, this is the phase for me to go for it and have lots of energy, right? And when that happens, sometimes we overdo. And one of the phases transitions to be most careful of actually is that peak phase to the recovery phase, or ovulatory to luteal phase, because you're going to be sort of downshifting. And I have found personally and with others that when you're going too fast, too hard, and you're sort of ignoring the fact that you're downshifting and needing to go into more of a recovery phase, then you sort of end up hitting a wall at some point. And that doesn't feel good then when you do get to your menstrual cycle in that way. And so one of the ways that you can sort of test this out, just for a practical thing to work with for those of you that are wanting to start to pay more attention to this, is if you have something in mind, like you are maybe going to go for a 3-mile run, but you're just not feeling it that day. And you don't know if it's because maybe you've been sitting around at the computer a lot and you're just sort of, like that feeling, or whether you truly are needing more rest and maybe needing something completely different. A lot of times what I suggest is going out and testing it. Just go for a 10-minute warm up, do your warm up, and then decide, because if you feel like you can go for it, then, well, maybe it was just you needed to get some energy moving. But if you do truly feel tired, then maybe you can do a walk run, or maybe you can just lower the mileage that you're going to do, or you can, go for a shorter duration, adjust something about it so that you can see what it is you might do. And what I find overall overall in the cycle is a lot of women are afraid to, like your client you were talking about, maybe to tone it down or to not do as much, because it's like, well, what's that going to look like then? Am I going to undertrain? Am I going to not reach my goals? For weight loss consideration, someone might be thinking, well, I'm using exercise for a weight loss tool. Like, am I not going to lose as much weight then? But what I have found is that our body adjusts throughout that cycle. So it's really the programming that we have from what we think it should look like that is a concern for us, because even in the luteal phase, our metabolism gets higher. So that phase that you're meant to recover and not maybe do as much activity, your metabolism
your body will
higher,
make up for it. Yeah.
And it adjusts. Like, that's just one example in the cycle, but it does that throughout the whole thing. Right. So that if we just trust it and pay attention, that it's probably going to work out just fine.
I've even noticed on myself, like there was a time where I was trying to work out, and I felt like I wasn't really losing the weight the way I would have thought. And then when I toned it down, I actually started losing weight more. I feel like sometimes you can get yourself in such cortisol that you're going to hold on to the weight, if anything.
That's exactly right. And that's actually something I didn't mention either when I was in my state of burnout and realizing I had some adrenal issues. I was experiencing pretty unexpected weight gain. Like, I hadn't changed anything. I wasn't eating differently. I was eating well, and I was moving obviously a lot. So you'd think like, wow, why is she gaining weight? Why am I gaining weight? But it was because of being in that too high cortisol state.
Yeah, because it needs to store on to some kind of energy if you're feeling such a deficit.
Yeah. So oftentimes it can have that opposite for sure. And we have this idea that more exercise in school, I learned this equation, which doesn't work, but it's lower calories, energy in, energy out. So lower the calories and then increase the energy that you're outputting if you want to lose weight, and adjust those two variables. And it doesn't always work.
If only we could be a formula, a mathematic formula. But, unfortunately, that's like, it could work for that one textbook person. Sometimes that's what I find with any textbook is that, you're going to have maybe a population that really responds to that. But it's just we're so unique. Yeah, as individuals.
It's more like a machine that would work in
exactly
in a controlled environment with no other factors,
exactly,
right?
That's right.
Exactly
right.
We are not.
Interesting. Yeah, no, for sure. And then you talk about the blueprint for moving our bodies in sync with our cycle. You pretty much spoke about that. That was the blueprint.
Yeah, those 4 phases are a really good place to begin, and just considering where you are and how you can align with that more.
Yeah, for sure. And so how did you see it impact yourself? Like, what do you feel? What's the difference between after you started to work out consciously like that?
Well, for one, the pain that I had during my period is gone. Like I've gone the longest period ever without having that. And I've done a lot of things to support my hormones. So I'm sure that there were other things that have contributed to that too. But I know that shifting the way that I work out has definitely had an impact that way. And I would also say, just what comes to mind is the way that it's like relieving that pressure or guilt. And, even for me, someone who really enjoys it and really is able to know what I need to do. And, if I have a certain goal, to know how to progress towards that. But there's still like this element just that I have taken on of, if I'm not doing it a certain way, then it's not enough. Or if I'm not doing, if it doesn't look a certain way, or it's not in a certain activity, then it's not enough, or I needed to do something else, or whatever it may be. But I've just come to more of a place of accepting whatever it is, and being really grateful that my body is able to go through those different fluctuations, and I guess have more appreciation for the fluctuations, rather than feel like I'm only satisfied when I'm in that inner summer peak phase. I've come to appreciate the other phases of that cycle more, because I see the benefit of them. I see the other things that they offer. And it's getting out of that mindset that I think a lot of times our culture has shown us, which is like that if that part of the cycle, that inner summer, that peak phase, those are energies that are really praised, I think, generally in our society, you know, productivity and creation mode and all of that, whereas the other ones are not. So I'm really grateful just in practicing this within myself that I'm able to appreciate all facets of the cycle. And that's extended even outside of my workouts, you know, just appreciating the different seasons of nature and the fact that I feel different during those seasons and maybe doing different things and just taking it as it is, and instead of wishing that it were this constant summer.
Yeah, and it's amazing because I find it so liberating.
Yeah, exactly.
Just to really honor ourselves as women is so liberating. And as soon as you do that, it's actually beautiful. It's a beautiful thing rather than something that confines us.
Yeah. Yeah. And instead of trying to keep up with something else or feeling like you should be, like, yeah, like you said, it's liberating. It releases that obligation and guilt factor and just has allowed me to have more of an appreciation for everything and also feel just more connected and in tune. I would say that's one other thing that's sort of related to this is by noticing and working with the cycle. And I know others have noticed this too, that when you do that, you become more intuitive. You are able you're able to know more about what your body does need instead of just following what's on a piece of paper. Because when we get too much into that and we're not even asking our body, like, what do you need today? Or how do you, how do you want to move?
We're too much here.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just helped with that. And that extends out to so many other things than, you know, being able to, as you said, be in your body and be in tune with that. That helps on so many levels.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I feel like I'm big on like whatever you are, wherever you are, like be in it totally. Because if you allow yourself to sleep when you're tired, just really fully just give yourself that, then you can really fully be active when you need to be active.
Yes.
And so, but when we do the opposite, we're neither here nor there. We're not going to sleep well. We're not going to be like energized when we're awake, and we're all over the place.
Yeah, I love how you put that. And that's exactly how I think of that, the cycle too. Like be in the menstrual phase and get that recovery, and then be in that peak phase and go for it. Challenge yourself, you know, have a PR that you're going to establish, you know, get that confidence that like, look what I just did, or look at how I can feel, look how vibrant I feel, and just enjoy that. But then contrast. Both. I love that. Just be in the one that you are in.
Yeah, be where you are. Just be present with whatever it is and honor it, you know, respect it and allow it a space.
Yeah.
So if somebody's interested in what we're talking about and they want to have a place to start, what would you suggest? Like maybe start journaling or paying attention to what your body's telling you throughout the cycle, or even like tracking the cycle?
I think that is the first step. Yeah, because it's too much to keep up here in our heads if we aren't putting it somewhere that we can then go back and look at the patterns or any kind of things that we notice. So at least if you're not tracking your cycle, which I'm guessing that a lot of your listeners might be, but if you're not, then start with that and just start to note what you do for your workout that day. And if you're already tracking your cycle, then all you have to add is the workout piece. So add what you do and try to add some notes in terms of like duration and kind of details of what you did. It doesn't have to be a lot, but maybe duration and your miles or some kind of number aspect, so you can go back and have some sense of what it was, whether it was an hour or a half hour or whatever that may be. And I also like to assign a rating to it of like how I felt. So however you want to work with that, in terms of whether you felt energized or not. And that's going to be helpful to go back and look to. So yeah, once you have that for a few months, then even looking back on the first month will be helpful. But after a few months, you may start to notice some patterns between the few months, and you can start to adjust from there based on what you might need to do different. And also if it's not even setting a plan and you're just wanting to listen day to day, then you'll know more what to expect so that you can have a starting point.
Awesome. So if people are interested in checking you out, going to visit you, how could people find you or work with you?
Yeah, my website, Jenni Hulburt, on Instagram and media. I also have a podcast. Since you love listening to them, you can go find the Wild Wellness podcast wherever you listen to those too.
Awesome. And I have all your links on the episode notes. So if anybody wants to find them, they're going to be right there. So thank you so much, Jenni. This was really fascinating. I really love talking about our cycles. I love moon cycles. I like anything to do with our cycles. I think they're so cool. There's such a mystery about cycles, but this is the first time I'm talking about really working out with the cycle. So I think this is a great topic that many people actually don't really realize is a thing.
That we can work with the cycle in that way too. Yeah. I'm so grateful. Thank you for having me, and hope this is beneficial for those of you listening. And thanks for everything you shared too, Michelle.
So that concludes today's episode. You can find all of the links mentioned on the episode notes. If you're enjoying these episodes, please take a moment to share and leave a review. Reviews mean everything to podcasters, and I really enjoy hearing from my listeners. You can also find me on my website at www.thewholesomelotus.com or email me at info@thewholesomelotus.com. I love hearing from my listeners. If you're interested and want updates as well as a free ebook on my top 10 fertility boosting habits, you can visit my fertility page on www.thewholesomelotus.com. I thank you so much for listening in and hope that you have a beautiful day.